When the first bits of video of the Outlaw were first released into the wider Valorant world, many people, including content creators, pros, and members of the community, believed that the gun would be overpowered or too strong in some way.
Kind of like short is wide, really
That is so fast.
quick. I think that's probably
That is so fast.
It is oppressive. It is broken. It is a gun that just doesn't really fit with everything else and attack FPS in general.
Now that a bit of time has passed though, and we're getting some of the first serious pro games using the Outlaw as well, I think that many people in the community have come to the conclusion that that was wrong. And so I decided to take a look at some of those early pro games to see how often the Outlaw was actually getting played in those games. And so that ended up with me taking a look at 15 maps where the Outlaw could have been bought by all 10 players in a majority of those rounds where they had enough money to do so. And in all of those instances that all of those players could have bought the Outlaw, it was only bought 19 times in 15 maps. And so why? Why is this gun that so many people thought that potentially could change the game, why is it not getting picked that much? Well, first, before we go into why it wasn't being picked, let's first talk about when it was picked. And to really no one's surprise, the gun tended to be picked in a round after winning the pistol round, and this makes a lot of sense. In that round, after winning a pistol round, you often might not quite have enough money to buy a rifle, but you will probably have enough money to buy an Outlaw and light shields and some utility. So it makes sense economically, and also it's very good after you win the pistol, because your opponents, whether they decide to save, the Outlaw will be a one-shot to the body and or legs, and if they decide to force, it will still be a one-shot to the body almost all of the time, and so therefore it's a very good gun no matter what your opponents do in that second round. And it's also a good option for the third round as well, of course, because especially if your opponents have managed the economy in such a way where they have light shields for the third round, then you become a massive, massive threat in that round as well, and maybe it can help you win a bonus. And in those 19 times that it was picked, it did okay. Some people got kills with it sometimes. There certainly weren't any sick aces or cool clips that I can really show you that will blow your mind. And weirdly enough, and maybe funnily enough, there was multiple Bucky clips across those games, which I will show to you now.
ile beraber İpot'un henüz skoru yok. Ki geçen haftaki maçı hatırlarsan muazzamdı. Her round gidip entry alıyordu İpot.
Evet yani bu
Şu
arada
şekil.
çok hızlı başladı
şekil.
İpot. Türko ilk kill aldı. 2'yi toparlayamadı. Bu istediği senaryo. Galacticos'un bir oyuncu daha var, Ruxic. Yeri henüz tespit edilemedi. Baki ile birlikte 2-2. 3! 4 gelir mi? Gelmedi.
And so yeah, we can get cool Bucky clips, but unfortunately the Outlaw is not quite there. But why was it not picked? What's the problem? Is it the gun? Is it the players? What's going on? Well, I think it's a bit of both. Obviously, the first thing is that people are still getting used to the gun. They just aren't as familiar with it as they are other guns. They probably aren't as comfortable using it as they are other guns. So, of course, they're probably not going to be using it maybe as much as they will much in the future, right? In a year's time or something when the gun is just one of the many guns and not the new gun in the game. The other thing that I think was vastly underestimated perhaps when those first couple of clips of it coming out were that the reload time does feel painful when you do miss a shot potentially with the Outlaw and then you have to scramble and reload and run away. It does feel like an eternity is going on as you are reloading the gun, and I do think that this was maybe undersold or not fully appreciated what that actually would be like when you are actually in the game rather than just being in the range where it doesn't really matter, or having infinite ammo on for some of those clips so they never are forced to reload and all you're seeing is the very fast shots that are coming out of the gun. And one thing that I don't think that a lot of people considered perhaps when talking about whether this gun would break the game or change the game in some significant way is the fact that it's a sniper rifle. And that significantly limits the amount of potential this gun has to completely take over a game, because most likely only certain agents are going to use a sniper rifle consistently throughout the game. Agents like Jet and Chamber, of course, might use them, but if you're playing Breach or if you're playing Astra, the Outlaw just probably isn't an option for you. And that was the case when I looked at those 15 maps as well. Most of the time, it was a Jet who was using it. And on maps like a Bind or a Split, maybe where there wasn't, a Jet or a Chamber that often, it didn't get picked that often on those maps, to be honest. It did sometimes, and there were certain instances, but certainly not a lot. And then the final thing about the gun itself, I think, is the cost. 2,400 credits, I think, is a very awkward space for a cost of a gun in this game because you're so close to being able to buy a rifle, right? You might think, well, if I just go light shields instead of full shields, now I can afford a rifle, so I'll do that instead. Or you might think, oh, maybe I'll just not buy this bit of utility and have a rifle instead, right? And a lot of people will often make that decision, which again, I feel like limits the Outlaw somewhat in terms of you have to be in a kind of very specific range of economy to decide, well, I can go for an Outlaw, but I'm not going to have enough to actually go all the way and buy a rifle. And with all of that said, and the fact that the gun only got picked 19 times across 15 whole maps of Valorant, you might start to get the idea that the gun maybe just isn't that good. But I don't think that's true at all. Because I think that the biggest limiting factor to the Outlaw's usage in the game is not the gun itself, but the people who play the game. Because one thing that I think is true pretty much universally across Valorant, across all ranks, from the very lowest all the way up to pro games, is that people don't abuse the broken stuff in the game nearly enough. The best example of that, in my opinion, is the Judge, a gun that probably costs way too little for what it actually does and how effective it is at its job. And the thing is, people don't buy this gun because they get conditioned very early on in the game that when you first start playing the game, you get told, buy a Vandal or a Phantom, pick one and buy it basically as often as you can. If you can afford to buy it, then buy it. And on the rounds that you can't afford to buy it, you want to save up so that you can buy it in the next round. And I think that that mentality of I'm either buying a rifle or I'm saving means that for those mid-tier priced guns, even if they are incredibly strong and potentially very overpowered, it's not fully recognized or realized because it doesn't fit into that mentality. And this, I think, very much affects the sniper rifles and the shotguns in particular, because on the defensive side, those guns are somewhat inherently unfair. The reason for that is, on the defensive side, you can often choose the range of fight you're likely to take. Obviously, with a shotgun, you're not going to put yourself at a long range angle and try and fight someone that's 30 meters away from you. It just doesn't make any sense. You're going to play in a close corner. And the inverse is true anytime you have a sniper rifle, of course. You're not going to put yourself in a tight corner. You're going to put yourself on a very long sideline. But the thing is, in those range of fights, those kind of weapons are somewhat unfair against a rifle. And so if you have a gun like a Judge versus a Vandal in a very close space, tight corner, the Judge is probably going to win most of the time. But the Judge costs significantly less than a rifle does anyway. And the same can somewhat be said for the Outlaw as well, that if you consistently put yourself on long range angles where it might be more difficult for someone with a rifle to hit you in the head first bullet, that you're going to have a decent chance of winning that fight with that gun. But again, people have been conditioned to just buy rifles, and really I think that in general, people tend to buy the fair guns way too often in Valorant in general. Guns like the Sheriff, guns like the Guardian, guns like the rifles. The rules are, if I hit you in the head, I win, but if you hit me in the head, you win. Those guns are inherently fair. They are playing by a similar set of rules. But guns like the Op, guns like the Judge, guns like the Outlaw to an extent don't play by those rules. When you swing a corner against a Judge, it's not if I hit you in the head, I win. If you hit me in the head, I win. It's you swing around the corner and I just jump around and blast you and you probably die. And so maybe people don't really want to do that because it feels cheesy. It feels cheap to potentially win like that. It's not a good expression of skill, which is perfectly fair enough. But then this also goes into pro games where there's potential money and jobs on the line, and people still do that and still play a lot of the time by what I would consider the fair guns. But there is another psychological element as well to having a Judge or an Outlaw on the defensive side. And that is, what happens when they don't come to your side? What happens when they go to the other side of the map and take the site, and now you're retaking with only a Judge or an Outlaw? And yes, that feels bad, but the main thing to consider here is that retaking anyway is bad. Here's a little stat sheet from Willminder here, showing the sites with the highest retake win percentage in VCT 2023, so 3v3, 4v4, and 5v5s. And you can see that the average win rate of those retakes is only 38.4%. So you're not likely to win these situations anyway. And there's only one site in the entire game which had an above 50% retake win percentage. And so yes, whilst it is frustrating to have to retake with a gun that maybe isn't that great for it, in general, if you're retaking already, you're already in a pretty bad situation. And so personally, what I would love to see, and maybe we will see this one day, I wouldn't expect it anytime soon, but I would love to see a YZ situation with the Outlaw happen, where someone takes a gun like the Outlaw to its extreme, like YZ did with the Judge. For those of you unfamiliar, YZ is a Chinese pro player who played in a game versus NRG on Split and consistently picked the Judge. Even when he had enough money to buy a rifle in quite a few of the rounds, he would buy a Judge instead on both defense and attack side. And he found a ton of success in doing so and really took over the game, often with a Judge. And I would love to see someone do that kind of thing with an Outlaw, maybe on a chamber or something, right? Where they can consistently TP away so that the reload isn't too big of an issue for them, right? Even when they have enough money to buy a rifle, you kind of build your whole identity and strategy around the fact that, you know, hey, I'm pretty much only going to be playing with the Outlaw and maybe the Op every so often. I can afford that as well. And so, in conclusion, I do think that the Outlaw has potential to be abused in certain ways, but we're just not going to see it. And I think it's very unlikely we will see it anytime soon. And so with that in mind, all of those earlier takes about how the Outlaw is going to affect the game and Light Shield meta is dead and all of that, none of that is true. And unless you run into a ranked game where someone is picking the Outlaw every single time, you should be going with Light Shields. You shouldn't have changed your strategy whatsoever. And if any pro team has changed from going from Light Shields to Full Shields because of the Outlaw existing, I'm going to lose my mind.